Probably the most melodramatic event that ever occurred in the history of the Cathedral Choral Society, and I certainly hope nothing like it ever happens again, was during a performance of Honegger's King David. And there was a blast, an explosion. As I faced the choir, it was up on the right-hand side on the first level, up there 60 feet above the floor, and you saw flames and smoke shoot out of this opening.
When I was conducting Honegger's King David, some smart young man had set a bomb. It went off during our performance, and Beverly Wolf was singing, and she didn't miss a note. A very cool lady.
The explosion had been the practical joke of an immature schoolboy. A more meaningful explosion was the cultural explosion that was about to hit Washington in the 1960s. Norman Scribner came to Washington to become, among other things, Paul Calloway's assistant.
Well, I remember when I moved to Washington in the fall of 1960, the Cathedral Choral Society was the dominant choral organization in town, and everything else was a far distant second, really, as far as I could tell.
Scribner founded the Choral Arts Society in 1965. Now there were 2 large choral groups in Washington. By the end of the decade, there would be 5.
The growth of the town never stopped. It continued after the war. People have a way of staying in Washington. So that following the Cathedral Choral Society as the seminal beginning, we had the Choral Arts Society of Norman Scribner, followed soon by Robert Schaefer and the Oratorio Society, then again by Paul Hill and the Paul Hill Chorale, and finally Paul Traver and the University of Maryland Choir. Now there are 5 within a radius of 12 miles of where we're sitting. Think of this. First-class, world-class organizations. That's the story, but Paul was the first.
And all of us at that time, I certainly did, and I'm sure my colleagues did as well, thought of Paul Calloway, the then conductor and of course the founder of the Cathedral Choral Society, as kind of the granddaddy of all choral music in Washington, and we were all kind of following his example.
Musicians of the stature of John Carlo Menotti and Samuel Barber had Washington premieres with Paul Calloway. Paul Hindemith returned in 1960 to conduct the Choral Society in his When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. Assistant music director Wayne Dirksen was personally responsible for one Washington premiere. He suggested to legendary pianist Dave Brubeck that Brubeck's new jazz oratorio, The Light in the Wilderness, should be performed in the cathedral. To convince him, Dirksen gave Brubeck a demonstration of what music sounds like in a grand space. He invited him to an impromptu jam session at midnight in an empty cathedral.
Well, I said, let me sound it out for you. So I got on and I began to improvise on the organ, and of course of some lively improvisation, I hit the theme of 40 Days, which is from the Light in the Wilderness Oratorio, and I started going on that. And he was standing up on the stall across from me just listening, and I finished up, and he was ecstatic. He said, that is just the greatest thing in the world.
Dirksen then asked Brubeck to play. It was almost 1 o'clock in the morning.
And he said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. He said, I'm going to take all the manuscript I got copies of everything, I'm going to wrap it and send it to you. And if you'd look it over, I'd be very grateful. By George, about 10 days later came a suitcase, and it was laid full of all of the manuscript for Light in the Wilderness.
CBS broadcast the Washington premiere of The Light in the Wilderness to a national audience. One of the most significant concerts of the decade was the 1964 Washington premiere of Benjamin Britten's War Requiem. With the nave now half built, Paul Calloway placed his chorus in a new space against the temporary construction wall. The somber setting was appropriate to the music, a lament for young men slain in battle. Outside the cathedral, construction had been brisk. Faced with choosing between completing the nave or completing the central tower, Dean Francis Sayer and the architects chose the tower. Washington had a more beautiful skyline now, but the Choral Society did not yet have the interior grand space of a completed Gothic cathedral. Few in those optimistic 60s doubted that the cathedral would soon be complete. In fact, that dream would not be fulfilled for a quarter century. Another dream was about to end.
There was a terrible event in the history of this country, which, however, had a fascinating parallel sequence here in the Washington Cathedral with the Cathedral Choral Society.
Martin Luther King came to the cathedral to deliver a sermon in April 1968.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
And he was shot that week, shot to death in Memphis. And Paul had scheduled a performance of the St. Matthew Passion. By Friday morning, much of the city of Washington in certain areas, 14th Street to 7th Street, was in flames and smoke you could see for miles around.
D.C. police imposed a curfew and told Paul Calloway that he could hold the concert only if he would shorten the music.
I was there and I knew that the cuts had to be made in order to satisfy a curfew. And I remember everyone scrambling right before that performance to make sure that we got some kind of balance to things, and suddenly creating a mini St. Matthew Passion.
There was no time to rehearse again. They'd finished rehearsing. Said, we're going to make cuts as we go along. You follow me, you listen to me, I will tell you what we're going to do next.
Events made musical cuts necessary. The musical cuts made an intensely emotional work even more emotional.
The drama of the work, the intensity of it, and as you sat there that afternoon, everyone knew that Martin Luther King had been in that church 1 week before, and you couldn't forget what was going on, and the text of the Passion took on added meaning because of that tragedy, but because of its statement of eternal hope.
Despite the political turmoil of the late 60s, Washington's cultural growth continued. The dedication of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in 1971 confirmed that, culturally, Washington had come of age. At the cathedral, construction accelerated. The plan was to finish the nave before the nation celebrated its bicentennial.
God said, "Let there be light," and there was light.
On April 16, 1976, Dean Francis Sayer dedicated the new rose window. The congregation sat in chairs, which for that day had been turned away from the altar and towards the magnificent display of light and color to the west. After almost 7 decades, the inside of the cathedral was complete. The Choral Society finally had a grand space for the performance of major choral works.